if there is there any questions right off the bat? Who's been waiting to come ahead? Yes, please.
Hello. Hello, Luc Heijsens, Code Buma. First of all, Mr. Malmont, I hear you are defending network neutrality and dark fiber. But what do you think about wavelengths? Do you consider them also as on the same level as dark fiber?
Could you repeat that question, please?
What do you think about wavelengths on dark fiber?
Wavelengths on dark fiber.
Yep.
I think it's a good question. I think and as I said before, you know, obviously what we've seen is that the best, from a theoretical standpoint, the best situation is when you have one player or one operator providing the dark fiber infrastructure. Then, depending on how the market looks and the maturity of the market, when you have different types of players, or if you already have, you know, it's in a greenfield situation, this would be the ideal situation, but you do not have the greenfield situation. You have a market where you might have some development, you might have one or two players and so forth. So depending on the market situation, I would say that the infrastructure provider, if we call it that, rather than operator, I would say, has to move in the value chain, obviously, to make it feasible to a certain extent. But that is on, you know, it's on a case by case, I would say. But from a theoretical standpoint, the dark fiber provisioning or the provision of dark fiber is, you know, so that's where, you know, that where you can see the best effects of it. Then, you know, you have, for example, the situation that the one question I always get is that, you know, not all and everyone would like to put their own active equipment on the network. Yeah, that's true, but that will not be the case in a well-functioning market, because you will have a communications operator being there, running an active network, you know, giving that as a service to whomever would like to have that service. So you know, theoretically, that's where that's the right positioning. Referring back to the dark fiber positioning, then obviously it's a case by case depending on what the specific market looks like.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Mitchell, regarding Google, do they offer dark fiber service or only internet access? On their networks they roll out, I mean.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part.
On the networks Google rolls out in the
Right.
different cities, do they only offer IP services, internet access?
Yes, they only offer IP services.
No dark fiber services?
That's correct. Although the interesting thing is that when Google goes into a city, following on Benoit's idea, it partners with the city. The city tends not to give Google much except for more expedited access to rights of way, sometimes dropping permit fees. But Google offers the city a full conduit as it's building its network at no additional cost aside from the cost of putting it in the ground. So it's the incremental cost of putting in a second conduit with the first conduit. And it's something that goes along with what Benoit was saying earlier about what does a city get out of it. So Google not only doesn't offer dark fiber, but they argue the way that they've built their network, it's not possible to do even an active open access kind of basis, because the entire network is built around the Google platform of Gmail identities and the other services that they offer. So it's not something that we would foresee them deciding to open up in the future because of the choices that they've made at this point. And then just there's one quick anecdote that Jonas reminded me of, and in the U.S., a city wanted to build a passive fiber network, and the incumbents said that's not fair, it would be unfair competition. And either the city or a local regulator said, well, how much do you charge to the incumbent? Asked the incumbent, how much do you charge for dark fiber? The incumbent said, oh no, we don't offer dark fiber. Well, then you're not a competitor, are you?
Okay, thank you.
I think that's to add to that, I think that's one of the fallacies and the risk. I mean, because when you enter into providing active services, I mean, it's, you know, because if you look at the commercial operators, the communication operators, or more the providing that kind of services, I mean, they rarely offer dark fiber because the margins are too thin. They would like to go higher up, that you know, to bitstream or wavelength or whatever they would like to add on top of it, because then they increase their margins. And I think once you entered into that you started on that journey, it's very hard to backtrack. So I think, the starting to take those steps, that will, I think there's a huge risk that it'll lead you away from being the infrastructure provider at the end of the day. So,
If I could just add something to that, it's interesting to look at how the New Zealand government structured the infrastructure deal in New Zealand. It recognized that in the short term, if only dark fiber was offered, take-up was going to be extremely slow, because the players in the market would have to invest massive amounts of capex to be operational. So it basically created a dark fiber obligation down the line. In other words, the way it's structured now, when the final deployment is done in 2020, from that point onwards, dark fiber will have to be offered. But the obligation is not from day one for the infrastructure provider. Just maybe an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah. I think one of the, to follow up that question, I think one of the things that is quite apparent in the discussions we've had today is that it's basically two situations. I mean, where you have networks, dark fiber operators, one thing is to evolve these companies and let them prosper. At the same time, we need to have a situation where we get a rollout of high capacity infrastructure broadband around Europe, and the circumstances are very different around Europe. At that time, you need to sort of work with what you have. But it's very important, I think, that you don't mix the two, because it is very much a question of adapting to both the investment side and the municipalities, the system of municipalities, how they work, national regulatory schemes and so forth matter in this making these investments. So I think as a conclusion, I will go around the table just sort of to say that, as Jonas said, that the dark fiber situation is the optimum one, and then Benoit, you are saying, well, it is a great system, but and you would advocate it fully, but you don't really think it's believable in the situation we have today, because today, as you said, there are fiber around. The universities are hooked up, so there's in many cases an impossible investment opportunity to make that happen. And in that case, you need to look at other ways of making these investments.
If I could clarify without taking too much time, the core notion is that we have to look at the successful ladder of investment model over copper.
Yeah.
The ladder of investment model only broke down when we got to a point where copper was no longer sufficient. But in actual fact, in the early days, the operators purchased active products. They purchased them centrally, then gradually they expanded their own aggregation network. They started buying bitstream locally, and when they had a critical mass of customers, they started unbundling. If we start with only unbundling as a solution, then that dynamic cannot exist, and we're going to create friction in the market that we need to alleviate. So that's why I believe that we should let players decide how they structure this. We should also remember that it's important that the ISPs be able to do a good amount of margin and survive on the basis of what's offered to them at a wholesale rate. One of the issues that I have with parts of the Swedish model is that when you have three layers, the middle layer as an independent entity actually eats up a big amount of the value. And I believe that that creates a problem for the guys on the top. The ISPs in Sweden are operating on extremely thin margins, and I'm not absolutely convinced that's survivable for them as entities. That's a different debate, but it might be interesting to discuss as well.
But aren't we in the long term looking at the technologies will overcome this problem? If we talk about, as you say, the middle layer, in sort of, as you say, self-advocate of structural separation, is that the goal that in the end game, that part will not necessarily need it.
I totally agree.
And that will
I just
increase
think-
the margin for the
I
operator.
just think we don't necessarily need three layers. I think
No.
the independent middle layer,
Yeah.
I'm not convinced is a part of the model that should necessarily be replicated.
No.
Let's put it that way.
But I think, okay, please.
Thomas, Stephen O'Connor from ESB, which is the national power company in Ireland. Christer, I enjoyed your presentation. I think any of us who are looking at deploying fibre networks are always looking for evidence that there have been societal benefits societal benefits and financial benefits. The one comment I'd just like to make, you made a point that you didn't think that any country, any of the member states in Europe would meet the digital agenda targets apart from Sweden. I suppose I'd just like to say that from an Irish point of view, we're actually optimistic or maybe even confident that we will meet the targets. On the first criteria, we have about 1 million out of our 2 million homes already have NGA. And ESB, in partnership with Vodafone Ireland, we're rolling out a fibre to the home network to another 500,000 homes starting in January. And then the government intends, with a programme, to roll out an NGA product for the remaining 25%. So we're optimistic we will make it on the first criteria and on the second criteria. So I just thought I'd make that comment.
Good on you.
Very good. And I think you're right. Of course, there is a number of brilliant examples, especially in the Baltic countries. But what I was referring to is that 50% of the inhabitants could have 100 megabits. And if we see that in Europe generally, it will not happen. But there is a few exceptions. And the Baltic countries and maybe Ireland. I've been on Western Ireland, and I have not seen 100 megabits in rural places in Donegal, for example. But I guess there will be a few examples.
Come back in 2 years.
Yeah, I will.
We'll invite you.
Since the Irish have taken over the floor, I'm an Irish lawyer. My name is Damien Collins with a law firm called McCann Fitzgerald. I worked on the project that Stephen referred to. And I think what's developing here is the Irish are kind of wannabe Nordics. So, I was very struck by all the presentations, and I'd like to thank the association for organising a fantastic afternoon. Obviously, the message that we got is the municipality model. I mean, from everybody who spoke, they tell us the municipality model is the model that works best in terms of efficiency, in terms of delivering consumer results. But then I was very struck by something that Benoit said as a lawyer, which Benoit said, the Stokab, sorry, my Swedish isn't very good, model was developed in 1994, and if the state aid rules had been around at that time, that model might not have been possible, from which I take a implication that the state aid rules in some ways may be an obstacle to the development of these kind of models. I mean, first of all, I think I'd like to ask the question whether people on the panel who have the experience would agree with that. And secondly, I mean, maybe open up the discussion, although I think you did have it a bit under veiled terms with Mr. Dupuy. Is there a reform necessary in the state aid rules to make them more realistic? Because we do hear about situations in which vertically integrated incumbents seek to use the state aid rules to actually inhibit, harass, delay the introduction of these more open...
A neighbouring country to yours, maybe?
I think it can happen all over the place.
Of course.
But where they actually use the state aid rules, maybe not to defeat, but to harass, to menace, to threaten, to delay the introduction of what this panel seems to think is actually a more efficient, consumer-friendly, environmentally friendly, possibly even a system than the incumbent-based model. So, do we need to change the rules?
Thomas Castin from IMAX and the Fibre to the Home Council. I more or less had the same question. I mean, I'm Swedish, but I live here in Belgium. So I've seen the municipality model succeeding in Sweden, but I don't think here we have such strong municipalities in the continental Europe all the time. So I'm not sure if that model will be the path to success here, to be honest. We don't see that much. So the question is a bit now, inspired by your question here. The incumbent may have to take a hit here if we believe that the structural separation is the model. Now, what will trigger that? What will trigger the structural separation? Does it have to come from a regulatory point of view, or can it be in the investors? And I'm thinking specifically about activate investors, because they're usually quite good at spotting opportunities to break up things where you see added value breaking up companies, right? So your thoughts on that?
I'll try and answer both, and I think others will have ideas.
I think we'll let everyone lean in the questions, but you can start, Benoit.
Yeah, so on structural separation, actually, the research that we've done, and we had a big webinar about this yesterday, but I'm happy to discuss this with anybody else and share the results. The research that we show is that actually it is not taking a hit. This is the important thing. The epiphany for us was that actually financially this makes a whole lot of sense for incumbents. The problem is that their worldview is such that today that it's not even a topic. It's anathema. It's a taboo. It's not something to be discussed. And their lobbyists have a clear mandate to kill any discussion on these topics. So what we're trying to show is simply that actually financially it makes sense. And we think the trigger then comes from the shareholders. The trigger comes from shareholders saying, you know what, we believe we want to separate this. Now we turn to the state and to the policymakers to try and understand what the conditions might be in terms of regulations, in terms of state aid, in terms of various obligations that the infrastructure layer might have, et cetera. So we believe that that's where the starting point should be. And as a kind of transition to your question, I believe this is a much more effective solution because it actually addresses the whole market, not just the cities, yes, not just the cities or the rural areas or various problem areas. It actually addresses the whole market. Having said that, what we have today is the state aid rules. I agree that there have been some abuses of the state aid rules quite clearly in the UK. There's a few documented cases of that. But, I mean, in the current market situation, I can also understand why we need these rules. And in fact, the European Union from the start has had rules in place in all sectors saying that public money should not be used to prop up private businesses, et cetera. So, understood. I can see the raison d'être, as I would say in French, for these rules. I also think that they have some unintended and negative consequences. One of them, for me, the biggest issue is patchwork deployment. Because effectively, by carving out the territory on the basis of the networks available, you inevitably create a situation where you can only deploy NGA through the city in certain areas and not in others. And that is, I think, a massive issue that should be addressed.
Yeah.
Others
Yeah,
chime in?
I think there is many answer on that question, depends on who you ask. But in my point of view, we are not talking about telecom. But broadband is born in the telecom industry. We are talking about building a society, a digital society. And of course, we can put that in the hands of the monopolists. Then we have to live with it. And they will be sorry all the way to the bank for that. So I think that we have to be realistic and say, we are building a new society. And how do we want that society to be? Should there be competition? Should it be high-speed communication? Should we be able to do this and that? I met one of the large incumbents in Europe just some time ago, and I asked them about the market share. And they looked very strange at me and said, we are the Deutsche Telekom. The question of market share did not exist because they were, in their mind, the only one that could deliver fast broadband. I think that is the question. And to measure broadband, high speed, we should not just include speeds, prices. We also need to include competition. The Swedish incumbent is doing a lot of good investments, but they would never done that without competition.
And I just want to comment a few things on the state aid thing. And I think, as you said, now being a lawyer, and at the time when these discussions were being very much at point at Stokab, I was the chairman of Stokab. This was in 2000 well, there was a time ago, some time ago, beginning of the 2000s. I can't remember exactly. But the important thing is that I would say that the interpretation is that I would say from my legal background and from all the studies that were being made that it was not a breach of state aid rules. But it's all in the application. I think that was the discussion that I had, that was the questions that were being implied, Mr. Dupuy, at an earlier stage, is that really it depends on what your perspective is. Is a perspective on 1 year that everything should be turned back? Or is it, if you have, for example, if the network is deductible in 12 years, shouldn't it be looked at as an investment over 12 years? Is there any is there any state aid during that period? Well, if you have that perspective, the question is totally clear in Stokab's case and most of the municipalities networks around Sweden. No, there is no aid over that period of time. And I think it's all in the application. I would like to go to you, Christopher, as well, because we were talking about this earlier today, and I think that's one of the problems, because that has actually been specified in some of the states around the US about what is, in European terms, is state aid and what is not. So I will let you comment on that.
Yes, there's been numerous accusations of cross-subsidies is typically how it's termed in the U.S. When courts have investigated, they've generally found that the accounting system was correctly allocating the costs. And in one memorable case, there was actually an accounting system that was developed by the incumbent that the municipality was using. So it was much harder to accuse it of that sort of thing. I think on this question, there's a story that sprung into my mind that I think is relevant and more useful for me to tell than to speculate on European laws that I don't understand all that well. But in Lafayette, Louisiana, this is Cajun country in the United States, the mayor there was leading this massive fight for years and years against the incumbents for the right for them to build their own fiber optic network. And he was testifying in the U.S. Senate on it. And he ended one of his speeches by saying, I don't think any state should be prohibiting these laws. And however, there's a part of me that says, tongue-in-cheek, that I hope 49 states, the whole rest of the country, makes this illegal, because we will welcome all of your tech companies into Louisiana with a big pot of gumbo. And I think that's something to keep in mind, because there's numerous problems we're facing with here. One is trying to make sure that we connect everyone and make sure that everyone has basic access, particularly at a young age for educational reasons. But another is business competitiveness. And it is not at all unrealistic to watch Stockholm take more tech companies. I met people in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who graduated entrepreneurial thinking recently, and they had to decide between moving to Tennessee or San Francisco to launch their big app, and they were moving to Chattanooga. People are, the societies this is changing, and it's not going to happen overnight, but I think major European cities have to think to themselves, do we have all the tools that we need to make sure that we have the ability to encourage the new industry? Because these people are, they're closer to my age than many of you in the room, and they move quickly, around as they need to.
What are you implying?
I just want to say something about the city networks. We have 290 municipalities in Sweden, and Stockholm is an exception. We have a lot of rural municipalities and remote places where no operator or incumbents would even dream on rolling out fiber. So we have seen the evidence that the small enterprises are moving away from these places. So the municipality was forced to do something, because the only one that was left behind was those that was living on the welfare. It was really costly for the municipality. They have to do something to stop that migration. So some of them asked the incumbent, can you roll out broadband or maybe high-speed broadband? And mostly cases they didn't even get an answer. So they rolled out it through their local power companies. And that's starting a movement where they competed with the incumbent, which forced them to invest in fiber as well. So now we could see that some of those municipalities that has more than 80% fiber to the home are these rural places.
Yes, please.
Sorry to ask another question. Just ask, Chris, one of your slides fascinated me, which was the map of Sweden with the areas which were serviced by municipalities, and then there were some which were yellow. I noticed, of course, it was in blue and yellow, very patriotic. But that the yellow parts were privately supplied with their broadband. And that provoked the question in my mind as to, is there a correlation, for example, between population density there? Or is there any, have you identified, or maybe Jonas has identified any factor that favors the use of the private networks over the municipality networks? It struck me as I would like to know if there's any reason.
I would also like to know that. We have tried to do research on that, but it's very tricky to get an answer. We have no. It's normally it has been some power companies, electricity companies that roll out the fiber, and some of them are private owned or partly private owned. But then we have seen some consolidation on the market, and we have seen some new investors, but still the major owner are the municipals. There are changes all the time, but we have also tried to see why does some municipalities have high fiber penetration and some other does not. To see is that those that have good economy, that has, well, this and that, but we did not find any evidence. But we could see something that has forced many places, especially in the remote areas, to roll out fiber, is that they have a champion. Someone, local guy that want to change the society. Like, we don't want to die. That's the most important force to have broadband.
Definitely true in the US as well.
I think
Okay.
I just want sort of, it's probably not the question, but I'd like to answer my own question then. And that is, I think, you know, if one back up from a bit, because we talk around the you know, state aid and so forth and et cetera, et cetera. I think the key thing here is that Sweden has we don't have a consistent model, I would say, because there's not such a thing that there is, you know, dark fiber being provided all around the place. Stockholm is Stockholm, and then it looks differently in other parts of the country. But the fortunate situation is that we have, you could say broadly, 3 different parties competing in broad or fiber rollout. You've got the incumbent, you have a PE-owned entity doing it as well, and you have the municipality networks. And that means that no one is owning the market. And, you know, whatever we've done is that we've created a situation where there is competition around it. There's no single one owning the market. So, and that means that we still are in control of it, to a certain extent. And then referring back to sort of broader European perspective, I think there is a very decisive point approaching rather quickly for many European countries, because you can clearly see that, you know, the working with the incumbents then, which you always have one incumbent in each of the countries, you can clearly see that they are approaching the point where they want to move away from the copper networks because they are getting too costly to maintain. You know, it's you know, the fiber discussion is out there, so you know, one shouldn't be cling on to the kind of world description that, you know, they are cuddling with their copper networks, because they are moving away from the networks. And if they don't get competition in that process, they will be able to dictate how they move from a copper network infrastructure to a fiber network infrastructure. And that is slightly what I think is happening in the UK, where BT is extremely clever in putting fiber to the curb, basically patching every opportunity for an alternative operator to move in, because the conversion rate will be so low, so the investment case is not there. And I think, you know, when you see that moment approaching, you can take 2 different directions. One is that you think, okay, is there a way that we can interfere in this process so that we at least have create some sort of competition in this process, and then have room to maneuver going forward. That is one decision. And then you know, if it's municipality network or if it's PPP kind of setups with the alternative operators or whatever, you know, doesn't really matter. You need to create the competition around the infrastructure. Or you can decide just to carry on. And what will happen then is that you put all your chips down for structural separation, which I think will be realizing I'm in a tight position here between the wall and Benoit. But I would say I still think that will be a tall order. Who would go first on that kind of venture?
I just need to come in here now, because we have 1 question from the floor, and then Christer wants to speak as well. Very, very quickly, Christer.
It's very quickly.
Okay, we just very quickly, and then we have the question. Okay.
Except from today, there has been a huge interest in what's happening in Sweden. Why could this strange place up in the north builds so much fiber to the home, and what has driven that. So it has been a lot of different organizations, politicians, operators, and so on. But the experience from this municipal-owned or regional network has formed into the Swedish Local Fibre Association. And they are today trying to cooperate with similar organizations all over Europe to spread the experience from Sweden to the rest of them. We have some representatives from that association here. So we could see that, yeah, there are a movement.
Yeah. Please, now.
Okay, my name is Maggie Sanderwee. I'm from the University of Ghent, not too far from here. And I basically wanted to tackle a new point, being take up and wholesale obligation. I actually wanted to ask my question when Benoit mentioned the New Zealand case. I was in New Zealand for quite some time studying that case, and I think it is a good model, but my main concern there is they are only allowed to offer wholesale services. So the ones that are deploying the fiber are not allowed to contact end customers, which is basically also similar to the Stokab model. They only do passive infrastructure in New Zealand. They also do the active services, but anyway, they are not contacting to residential customers. But take-up there is not that good. And then the main difference that I see in between the case of Chorus in New Zealand and Stokab is that a significant amount of revenues from Stokab doesn't come from residential customers, but comes from media companies and other types of businesses. And this is not possible in New Zealand. So I was wondering, what do you... I direct my question to Benoit, but maybe someone else wants to answer as well. What is your opinion about that?
Well, first of all, it's great to meet you in person. We've exchanged 3 emails over the years, but just to update what you said a little bit, the take-up is actually growing faster and faster now. Over the last 6 months, it's really started to clinch in New Zealand. There is no doubt that the obligations that they face in terms of treating every customer equally means that they can't separate the business market effectively from the residential market. But even with the relatively major road bump that they've had to face in the copper pricing review, which effectively takes a third of their revenue away starting next year, they've managed to rework the model in a way that they believe it's financially viable. So, of course, it's more challenging. It's also on a different scale, because even though New Zealand isn't a massively big country, it's still not the same deploying in a country and deploying in a city. But I believe that if there is one model that we should be looking at for interesting policy looking forward, it is still the New Zealand model today. But again, we're taking it away from cities here and looking at it globally across most of a nation. It's 75% of the territory. There's one point also, which is not a direct response to what you said, but is a more general point that I wanted to make. One of the things that has frustrated me over the years with European policy and with many regulators around Europe is that I don't think they have basically made a clear decision between the notion that fiber would be a natural monopoly or that you should have infrastructure competition. And I think this hesitation between these two models has created a lot of the problems that we see today. Because I believe there are solutions in both of these directions, but you have to go there and stick to that. If you're constantly waving between the two and trying to have a little bit of infrastructure competition and a little bit of natural monopoly, which is exactly what the French situation is today, you end up with a model that is completely unworkable, and in fact it's unreadable. I was unfortunate enough to have the guy who designed the model present the model and understand that he didn't understand his own model, so it gives you a sense of how complex these things start to be. I hope that the new Commission actually takes a firm stance on that in one direction or the other, but at least says the policies should orient us in that direction.
Yes. I think we are going to conclude now, and please do continue the conversation and the questions and this very interesting topic. We can talk about this all day. How to really achieve the broadband rollout that we all want to achieve. And I think we are in a very interesting situation right now, because we are moving from copper, we're moving to fiber, and as I think Benoit stated, I mean, in the best of worlds, maybe we would have, if we would have done it from scratch, we would have structurally separated. But as Jonas is pointing out the realities, that is most probably not the feasible way to move forward. And how do we do it then? And that is a challenging regulatory task for the Commission. And I know that all of us here, and there are a lot of players in this field that would love to contribute and discuss with the Commission, you know, heading this difficult task for the coming years. Thank you very much for being here today, and hope to see you soon sometime again. Thank you. Bye.